Hello, everybody. So I'm Matthew Studley. I'm from the University of the West of England, where I work in the Bristol Robotics Lab, and I do robots and ethics and stuff like that. I'm here now to introduce our panel discussion. As I was coming here today, I heard a couple of tourists, I think they just got off the bus, and they were asking some people, how do we get to see old Bristol? And the answer was, well, it's all around you. And as I walked here, I was looking at the houses and thinking, these buildings have been here for hundreds of years. And there's a feeling of permanence about that everything stays the same. And yet here we are with a technology, AI, and if I was going to liken it to something, it would probably be dynamite. So it's got the potential for fundamental change. It can cause change very rapidly. And the consequences of this change could be unforeseen. Of course, we can also have foreseen consequences. We can use this technology to affect massive change, and this change can be good or bad. So how do we avoid getting meshed in the wheels of this machine? What we're going to talk about now is inclusivity. How do we avoid magnifying social problems in the use of this new technology? Now, this is particularly pertinent at the moment. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen all sorts of announcements. We've seen BT announce that by 2030, they'll have made 40% of their workforce redundant because of artificial intelligence. We've seen an announcement signed by many of the leading lights in AI, calling for AI to be recognized as something that needs to be mitigated against as a potential agent of human extinction. Now, this is very purple prose, perhaps, but it does indicate the scale of the change, the scale of the challenge. Part of this challenge and the way that we deal with it will be through regulation and through all of us as individuals being given a voice and being given power. So, let me introduce our panel to you. So we have, and I'll be very brief, you can read the long bios on the website if you like. We've got Tom Appleby. Tom is in law. Most of his work is in environmental protection, and he brings existing law to bear in order to force policymakers and governments to do what they should be doing and protect the environment. We've got Darren. Darren is MP. He's one of the leading lights in governing science and technology, and with the events as they are in the UK, may be playing a much more pivotal role in that in the near future. We have Joyanne. Joyanne is all around inclusivity in media and in marketing representations, and that's where her work has been, trying to move the discourse and the images away from the familiar and traditional into something which is more representative of us as a culture, as a nation. And we have Mark, and Mark's been a technologist who's been involved in all sorts of really exciting stuff: space research, ExoMars, robots, everything from fundamental research through to things at a very high technology readiness level. The panel is chaired by Kate, who you've met already. Kate leads the Jean Golding Institute and has an extraordinary background spanning many different disciplines and some very multidisciplinary research. So here's your panel. Ladies and gentlemen, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I do have some questions for the panelists, but what I'm hoping is that we'll have some time to take some questions from the room as well. If there is a really burning question that you would like to ask that kind of follows on from something, do put your hand up. The people in purple and pink will be able to come over with a mic, and we can maybe get some conversation going in the room. Great, yes. And if you want to click through to that QR code, you can also ask questions via our Slido. Who's going to be manning the Slido? Elaine, thank you, Elaine, is going to be manning the slider. So we'll try and cover all the bases. I'll do my best. Right, so we're going to start by thinking about how organisations should consider data bias. How can we ensure that data science and AI solutions consider data bias, and what are the risks if we don't? And I think we're going to start with Joyanne. Over to you.
Yes. Ooh, never know the volume of a mic. Or everything around me. I think one of the main things in my work is getting people to start thinking of bias from the get-go. I've heard a lot of amazing talks, and sometimes as organizations or businesses, we tend to think the bias is not there, or someone else collected the data, so we just have to worry about missing cells, or we just have to worry about whatever it is to process. But a lot of the stuff I do in my work helps people to understand that no matter your intention or the context of the data, there's underlying bias throughout. And that's in every scenario, every situation. So a lot of times, organizations, businesses tend to feel that they are removed because they're not in the humanitarian sector, or they're not in a sector that's directly impacting individuals' well-being. But their work, like marketing, it influences so much. Like if I was to say to you, what color is Santa Claus's suit? Majority of the room will say red, I assume. Again, my bias being in the West, but that wasn't always the case. That's marketing influence. But what are the other places that marketing has influenced people's decisions and has a greater impact on society? So one of the main things I think is organizations needing to start with bias in every decision and acknowledging that it's present.
And what mechanisms do you think organisations can actually employ to do that? What are the interesting ways in which we can kind of engage with that?
The biggest mechanism is, well, we're starting it. Businesses are starting to acknowledge what their organizations look like. They're starting to acknowledge that, the ones making the decisions are all old, middle-class white men who speak majority English and went to fancy schools. No offense to any of my panelists, if that suits you. But that first acknowledgement, it kind of highlights it. But then the second acknowledgement is, I think, acknowledging who's in the room, great. But when we're thinking about data, sometimes people wait for a person of a different background or a different experience to come in before they make a decision to think, what is the impact? Or they wait for that individual to tell them something's wrong. And I think the next stage that organizations need to step into is whatever experience, whatever level you're at, whoever's in the room, speak about it, start with it. Don't wait for someone else to tell you.
Thank you. And Darren, what role do you think government should play in the further development and application of data science and AI then? Might there be a role for AI in government, do you think?
Well, we should continue to fund excellent institutions like yours to keep doing the work, obviously. And yes, of course, there's going to be a role for AI in government, a whole kind of number of layers. A lot of the discussion in the last few weeks has been around national security and geopolitical cooperation on the international stage, and government will obviously play that role in that space. But also the government is a provider of public services. It employs public servants. And at the moment we have enormous challenges in our public services around access, around quality, and around cost. And the government is going to have to lead reform and modernization of public services in order to improve access, improve outcomes, and reduce costs. And the only way it can do that, in my view, is by adopting technology more broadly, and indeed AI, so that we are rebuilding our public services to be fit for the modern age and allow you to access them in the way that you need to access them. There's then a broader piece around what's the role for government in terms of the private sector, which we can talk more about if you'd like. But in that sense, the government has less of a direct role to play, but has to create the right incentive structures for workers and businesses to not fear the impact of these technologies and to actually want to grab the opportunity and implement them.
So there's lots of discussion at the moment about the regulatory environment for AI. What's your view about the role that the UK could play in that developing kind of ecosystem of regulation around AI specifically?
There are kind of three buckets of regulation that we're thinking about. There's kind of traditional regulation, the Information Commissioner worrying about privacy, Ofcom worrying about content moderation, other regulators thinking maybe about safety or human rights applications. They need more capacity and budget to do this work in this space, but we kind of know how that operates. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the global regulation around national security risks And I don't think we fully understand yet what that needs to look like. It's one of the reasons the Prime Minister's in the United States at the moment, is to start to have that conversation. I think we will end up in an environment where, for companies that have the most advanced compute capacity for generative AI models that could create novel national security threats, there might be a new form of agency or oversight in that space, but it's very early stage discussions yet. And then you've got the kind of really difficult bit in the middle, where you see that AI will have a disruptive impact on whole swathes of the economy and the way we live our lives, and it's very hard to anticipate all of those outcomes in order to regulate at the outcome end. And so we have to think much more about how do we ensure principles-based regulation that guarantees human rights, the values that we have in our society, and supports individuals in a new way. And we don't have a regulatory environment yet that's actually going to do that very effectively, so it will have to be new.
I can feel Tom wanting to wanting to come in at that point. So, I mean, how do you feel about the pace of legislation and regulation? Can we keep up with advancements? Are there other things we should be doing?
Well, if you take a step outside of it, what we've got is a series of machines. We've had machines, and we've been making machines since we had opposable thumbs. So this isn't new. The pace of it is new, I think. Some of the machines are wholesome. I mean, there's some brilliant stuff being done with AI, and I think of the environment stuff, the ability to process data that quickly is absolutely amazing. Some of the stuff is terrifying, and I think we start thinking about it because of large language models this year, but because the development there was just so astonishingly fast. I think no one knew it was going to happen that fast. But we've had AI in Meta for quite a long time, and I think it is fair to say that the use there has been very, very, the reverse of what we were talking about earlier about inclusive stuff. It's been amazingly divisive and polarizing us all. So, and to the extent that Meta are now being sued for genocide in America, for the massacre of the Rohingya people, under existing law. So there's an outer skin here of just looking at these things as devices and kind of taking away the tech bro psychobabble and looking objectively and saying, look, is the machine that you're creating absolutely toxic? In which case we should be looking firstly as, actually the last speaker, and I didn't catch his name, I'm so sorry, but it was one of the best presentations I've seen for a very, very long time, extremely thought-provoking, so thank you very much. But that idea of having people power outside of the regulatory system to say we don't have to wait for the ICO and Darren to get in and sort it out, we can do it ourselves and basically start litigating for the stuff that's harmful. I suppose that's my message. And, yes.
And I'm interested in, Mark, your take from the very much a commercial sector about what's your view of the regulatory landscape that we currently have and what it might look like in the future and what that would do to your kind of industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when it comes to ethics and, can robots be biased and that sort of thing, I think the answer is yes, but they don't have to be. I think there's three things we need to think about. We need to think about transparency. We need to think about evidence and tools. So I think the onus is on industry in a way to sort of help answer those regulatory questions with the right tool base. I don't want to make this sound like the answer to technology is more technology. It might sound a little like that, but the pace is the thing, right? And I think as an industry, we're well placed, especially in Bristol, to create some of the tools that can help support the fast decision making that the regulators are going to need to actually look to try and answer some of these questions. I think that needs to be based on evidence. We need to provide that evidence. And I think the other thing is transparency, really. I think we can create all sorts of machines that do all sorts of things, but we need to be really clear about how they're being created. I'd often say, it takes a village to raise a child. We say that, right? But we never get to interview the village, in the human context. But in the machine context, we can. I'm a little bit positive about this. I think there is the possibility to actually very clearly start to look at how that machine was created and therefore have some evidence of how it might perform in a complex environment and then provide evidence to the regulators to help do something with.
I was going to ask you exactly that. So we're talking about bias in AI systems. So robots can be biased too, right?
Exactly, they can. As I say, though, I think the key, of course they can. Well, to an extent, if we open the box of what is a robot these days, AI, the type that's in the news at the moment, is only one of those tools. There's several other tools in there. And actually, quite frankly, a lot of robots at the moment are very deterministic, well-ordered things. But that will change because this technology opens up a whole bunch of other possibilities, lots of much higher-end decision-making that we can do, But again, I come back to that point is we can form some traceability about where the data has come back to the points were made earlier, but where did that data come from? What bias is inherent in that? And then we can lay that out, and that helps us understand just what levels of bias are in the robot.
Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Just ask you. Oh, sorry. But can I ask a question? Oh, you want to go first?
I was just going to say on your point about, you mentioned it's very small about removing bias, and I just want to say you can't in any way, shape, or form. We can reduce it and manipulate it, but I think it's a false hope to tell people that we can remove it because humans are involved and humans will always be involved. So we cannot remove it, is my opinion.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Just to maybe clarify that, what I mean is we need to identify the bias. We can't remove, but we can definitely identify it, and then when we identify it, then we can act accordingly.
The point I suppose I wanted to make on that is that the difficulty I find as a lawyer looking at this is that the regulatory environment for the development of most AI is Silicon Valley, and it's a particular type of philosophy of a kind of libertarian, fake it till you make it, crazy kind of stuff that does not exist in Europe apart from the kind of lunatic fringes almost. It's totally unindigenous to us. And that is why actually I kind of think we need to break up the kind of big monopolies and have stuff focused in the UK and Europe. Actually, I was talking to somebody from Kenya earlier, and I was thinking, actually, how culturally specific is the development of the tools that we're making for Africa, which has got, Kenya's got a wider variety of cultures within it than we probably do in the UK. So there's something in here about taking out the Americans from this, building a few barriers and giving ourselves a breathing spot. I just wondered what your views were on that.
I mean, it's a fair point, because if we start to have machines making higher order decisions, then they will be culturally specific, and we have to accommodate that, right? Interestingly, we're in the era of LLMs now. That's the topic du jour. But embedded in language is an awful lot of cultural specifics, which I think gets lost when we only deal primarily with one language on a global scale. Again, maybe with a little bit of a positive mindset, there's the potential to recover that and embed that in some of the training that we use to create these machines, and therefore reflect that cultural specifics that need to be accommodated.
I'm going to jump on that question then and ask you something which is not pre-prepared as a panel. Which is, we use the terminology of AI. Is that terminology vocabulary useful or not useful to us? Who wants to jump in with that? Joanne, go ahead.
One,
yeah.
It's marketing's fault. It's not useful, but I think the general public is changing, and because that's the perspective I have to think about it. We are all in this room because we have an interest in data, so therefore we know a little bit more. And I would say before the rise of ChatGPT, you say AI, people think iRobot, they think, is it Terminator? Yeah, that's where their mind goes to. And then we had Black Mirror, and people started thinking, oh yeah, AI and algorithms. And that's generally, but things are changing a little bit more. The general public is saying things like large language models. So personally, I think AI needs a rebrand, because it's not intelligent as the way we define intelligence, but intelligence was defined by old white men anyway. So I would love for it to have a rebrand. I don't think it's helpful for the general public.
Interesting. Who else would like to jump in on that? Tom, are you?
Yeah, I kind of got there's an interesting, I agree with what you're saying, but there's an interesting spin on a bit of this. And that is that the general defense that Meta have for them being able to basically play with our minds is that we're just communicators. Communication is good. We're just a machine. We've just got this little bit, and we take information from one person, we give it to somebody else. Well, they're not doing that, because in the middle, they've got their own artificial mind, which is processing that. They have a feed that fires you stuff. And they're pretending, on the one hand, that doesn't exist, and that's how they get around what's called Section 230 of the Digital Communications Act in the US. But I think they are doing something. I think that machine in the middle does exist, and I think it is a controlling mind, and that's controlling us. So I think there is an artificial intelligence in that particular example. I think there isn't a lot, and I think that is affecting us, and I think we're in danger of becoming tools of that particular form of intelligence. And then you go to that station, then you go to a next level of that, which is probably taking us a little bit far, but you get this idea of legal personhood and what that means when we create it. Now, LLMs have developed at such a pace that conversations that we were in the law, we were going to be having about this in 25 years' time, we started to have now to think what that means. I mean, do you turn it off? Are you killing something? So you get into this space of what it is. and probably is worth doing, because if that is like a child in there, what have we done to it? We've sat back and we've plugged it into the Bard has just gone live onto the internet, and God knows what's on the internet, but there's pretty nasty corners of the internet out there. We're feeding this artificial mind on this stuff. In any other context, that would amount to child abuse. So perhaps, I do agree with what you're saying, but there's that corner of AI which is reflecting back on us, which is very, very dangerous and probably worth thinking about.
Okay, I'm going to let Joanne come back on that, and then we're going to stop this train of thought and go to some of the Slido questions.
Sorry, the alarmist language you were using throughout of that was just triggering me throughout.
Oh, sorry.
AI is a puppy, it's not a child. Like, oh my gosh, it's math. And yes, there are things that happen, but we don't understand it because we can't equation and work out that math. We can't take it and spell it out ourselves as of yet. That's what it's doing in advance. In terms of social platforms, it's just understanding the things that we don't take mind of. You spend a microsecond on an image, it's going to show you other people's jeans and shoes. It's not intelligent, it's math. And it's a puppy that can be trained for different purposes. The alarmist language for me triggers a lot because then you're going to have people prioritizing, should we turn a machine off versus its impact on marginalized communities. No, we should better and create things for society and humans before we concern ourselves with whether we turn a machine on or off.
Okay, this is really interesting because this encapsulates some of the tensions I think that are going on in the wider discourse. So thank you for that. I do want to move to some of the questions that are coming from the audience. So let's go. Well, we can go with the first one. Why not go with the first one? Does data lie? I'm going to go to Mark for that one.
Yes and no, maybe. Maybe it's a yes and no answer to that. I think data is just data, right? Data is just data. There's stuff embedded in that data, clearly, and it's back to that point about how do we know what that data means and what it's saying to us. So really, does data lie? Well, it depends how in robotics world we speak a lot about ground truth. So how do I know the thing that the robot is telling me is true? And we have a completely separate, as best we can, we have an independent, separate system that tries to validate that its behavior is as accurate as it can be. So I think it's a relative question. We need to have something in place that basically validates whether what we're determining from that data, with our own bias in the mix as well, is actually true or false. So I think it's a bit of a relative question in that sense. But you do need that independent means to try and validate your interpretation, I suppose I should say, of what's in the data.
Thank you. And we've got a number of questions coming in about regulation. So we've had quite a big conversation about regulation, but I think there is one thing I'd like to pick up about this, maybe to Darren. So we elect people to speak for us in Parliament, and in other areas of life, we're starting to use AI systems or machine learning systems to make decisions for us. Is there a future where that might be integrated into government in some way?
I think there's a really interesting debate about how, the topic of this discussion, inclusivity, how do we have a more inclusive democratic process? Taiwan in particular has been working on this for many, many years. And what that would look like is there would be a way for all of you to know what's going on in Westminster and to be part of that discussion. Not just through your directly elected representatives, but as individuals. Now, there's some fundamental questions there about our constitutional structure and what that means, but I would absolutely support the idea that you get more of a say. The challenge for us, though, is then making sure that the input is not biased based on the people that want to have a say and the people that don't. And so we do end up going around in circles slightly. But I would like to think we'll have more of these tours. My only observation on the operation of Parliament is we tend to operate in 100-year cycles. So we're probably not going to get there anytime soon.
Yeah, Joanne, go ahead.
Quick fun idea. A lot of people don't read parliamentary reports and don't read all that stuff that you put out. You can use AI to help summarize that and make it palatable for the general public.
Can I just come back on that?
Yeah.
We used ChatGPT to put we've got a multi-method approach to looking at European law corpus at the moment because it's complicated and it doesn't necessarily speak to each other. It is a kind of code. It's a code of human behavior, if you like. So it is a model in its way. So ChatGPT models should be able to do this. What was fascinating was it got 9 of these things right, came up with some really good bits of legislation. Then it invented one all on its own. There was a 10th that didn't exist. So then that made me thinking, my lawyers had been sitting on it thinking, can I sue ChatGPT for getting it wrong? I mean, are we putting these things out that they're reliable, or are they just indicators? Google's fine because you search it and you make the decisions. ChatGPT is starting to make decisions for you on how you interpret these things. So you always, I think at a base level, you're always going to need the humans to check. But when you can't trust the output and it's eloquently written, then we start to go into a very fuzzy area of actually the degree of certainty which you can put to that device.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions that are kind of coming off the back of that, which are about the role of educators and education, and how we should or should not be using AI. So there's a question here, for example, what role do you think educators have in this space? And there was another question which I think has scrolled off the screen about what role AI might play within universities, and how do we account for that? I don't know if anybody would like to take that. Joyanne, yeah?
So I am associate lecturer at Berks Spa University, and it's a huge problem, but it's a huge problem for the students that are not trying and not making any effort. For the students that are engaging and actively using AI as a somewhat companion to work out their thoughts, it's beneficial. But I think in the education system, if we go or we lean on a model where we test people based on their understanding and not their memorization, then we don't have to worry about AI. But right now it's all on, can you memorize the right answer for this? Stick it into the engine, get the answer out.
Yeah, Tom, you're also working in a university
think,
context.
Yeah, I do. And there's an issue here about the whole process of learning. And the difficulty with LLMs in particular is they use neural nets, so they actually learn in a similar way to we do, to us, and they process information in a similar way to us. And actually, the act of writing, I certainly find when I'm writing something, I'm choosing the next word, and I'm thinking where I'm going, and I analyze law, so, it's a very, it's quite like maths, really. The process of going through the equation, the process of writing down the law is part of your thought process. So when you read something and you've got all of that information out, then you're losing that part of the thought process, and you're learning that part of the learning journey, and you're kind of dumbing yourself down. So we haven't, and I think also it would have been nice if they'd told us it was coming. I mean, we got this in the middle of the semester, and suddenly we were trying to reverse engineer how to find out how to work out whether students had cheated.
So from my experience at the University of Bristol, we've also been running to catch up, I think a little bit. But my view, for what it's worth, I know I'm just chairing this, but we embrace, as educators, we embrace new technology, and we embrace new ways of learning. And if it challenges us a bit to come up with new methods of assessment and new ways of working with our students, then I don't think that's a bad thing. Okay, let's move on to some other questions that are coming from. Thank you for your questions, by the way. We've got one in the room. Let's go with that. We haven't done that yet. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this kind of plenary session. I very enjoyed it. And my question is related to maybe some taking some responsibility for the future generation, because all of this stuff related to IE, and I think the virtual kind of life is coming, so kind of a virtual environment. We are creating such kind of platforms where people play kind of a role. Yeah, so I just want to know, for example, is there any kind of a I think it would be beneficial to have a kind of an institution which is regulating all of this kind of IE stuff, and this institution should run a kind of a public engagement related research to negotiate with taking some regulations. You will take also the responsibility for the future generation, and this kind of platform will create a kind of a very good opportunity to involve from the public part. There would be kind of maybe some initiatives, and this institute will create some regulations. So this would be very kind of a fast decision-making process. So how do you think? Is it kind of a good way of going further? Maybe it's more related to Darren Jones. Yeah. So thank you.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things in your question. First, around kind of future generations, just to build on what was said before, I don't think you can ban these tools. They're not going anywhere. So don't ban them, use them, and use them in a way that works in the education process. I would love for my kids at school to each receive a personally delivered bespoke curricula at the rate that suits their learning, but the class teacher's going to have to know how to use software, big data analytics, and all that type of stuff in order for that to happen. So there are enormous opportunities there, but we've got a long way to go. You touched a little bit on kind of virtual reality worlds and digital worlds. I did some work on the online safety bill, which is now in year 8, which is a classic example of why we're not quick enough in Parliament. That bill started thinking about 2D websites on Facebook, and now we've got, virtual reality to deal with. My observation, though, is that actually a lot of the things that we're trying to do are laws that exist in the physical world. We've just got to implement them in the digital world, and actually that's really not as difficult as maybe as it sounds. You just need to keep up to date and have the regulators with the appropriate resource to do that. And just lastly, on your institutions point and in engaging the public, do you know, my sense is that it feels a little bit like things like consumer law or even climate change to a certain extent. Many members of the public got very busy lives. They actually want their legislators, the regulatory bodies we create, the institutions, to get on and do the work. And they want to check in, and they want to know what's going on, and they want some accountability over that, and they get to vote at election time. But do I think that a representative sample of my constituents are going to want to really get into the weeds about how a regulator regulates this space? No. And so actually, I'm all for public participation. I work very hard at doing that in my constituency, but it's upon us, whether we're academics, whether we're running businesses, whether we're in political institutions, to try and get this right on behalf of the public. And we've only just really started at the very tip of this debate, and I think it's going to be a much more prominent feature in political and economic discussions in the years ahead.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Ernesto at the front, and then I'm going to go back to the questions on the Slido. No, it's all right. Richard's on his way.
I wanted just to disagree slightly with this notion that we have the tools to regulate AI or data, right? There's some spaces where we actually have no idea. For instance, let's talk about DNA. DNA breaks the whole notion of personal property, kinship, and national property. So when you share your DNA, right, you're not just sharing your data, but you share data of lots of people. So lots of the new things that are really interesting is not really, I don't think AI is like intelligent really. Right? The algorithm is not so, they don't know how to judge things. That's why they ask us to go and check what's happening with the image. When they start doing that, we might have to discuss different things. But so far, data that is not so complex is already breaking our imagination of what is property. So I don't think we can just use things we had before to adapt to these new challenges. DNA is one of those. And actually, we have no good legislation or regulation to deal with that. The other thing that I find a little bit of a pipe dream is that we can regulate stuff that we don't know how it's going to evolve and who should be regulating that. If by regulation we mean more institutions, that sounds a little bit useless. But I mean, maybe I'm wrong here.
Thanks. Yeah, Tom, do you want to come?
Yeah, I went to the Molly Russell inquest, which is a very, very interesting case. I don't know if people saw it, which was the teenager who got deluged with stuff on her Instagram feed, and the coroner found that the Meta algorithm, the various social media algorithms had contributed to her death, which was interesting because I'd be interested to see the civil law case coming out of the back of that. I think what was very interesting was that the Meta representative, Elizabeth Tagoni, when she was on evidence, said, well, you should have stopped us before we did that. You should have known. The regulators should have been there to stop us doing this, because the question after that was put to her was, by the barrister, was, well, you've been experimenting on children, because they hadn't done any age certification when they'd put this AI on. And she was being fed really horrible, toxic videos by her Instagram feed of basically glamorizing suicide. And I watched the videos. They were very harrowing. They're beautifully done, but haunting. Very much like the kind of stuff that you're doing. But I don't know who makes this stuff, but it was all landing in her head. And I hope the regulations do exist, actually, because I'd say that that is a toxic machine, and there's plenty of law around already to sue people who are making machines that are toxic. And I hope that case does go to court, because it'd be very interesting to see. But the idea that Meta had, that well, you should regulate us first, was one that they put on the witness stand, which I thought was and I've been trying to get a transcript of the evidence, actually, because I think there was a lot she said there that I think would bear greater scrutiny.
Just to comment on that, just to try and bridge a few things, I'm probably going to go back to tools again. I think maybe there is an onus on us to actually wargame these scenarios as they come up, but have the tools to support that fast wargaming so you can get the evidence to think about that. I think there is some responsibility to look at what the implications of what's coming out, but it's hard to just imagine what that's going to be without some decent substrate and some tools to give you that support. So I think there's a need for the regulators to take the responsibility, but also then to have the tools to support them in doing that.
I just jump in there really quickly and say that I think it's really important in that conversation to broaden the diversity of voices that we hear as part of it. Sorry, Joanne, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, the whole notion of regulation is a long process. Maybe we just need a 10 commandments. Like, as a society, we have all agreed murder is bad. We put people in jail. How they get to jail, that is flawed, and the system is flawed. But as a society, we have agreed that. Maybe we just need simple things that we all agree is bad with this technology, that is realistic to where the technology is at. I'm still going to push back on that intelligence bit, and again, alarmist language with highlighting one case study, because social platforms work in various ways. But if we have a 10 commandments where we agree and we can say, okay, if this algorithm does not work for a certain proportion, we agree we shall not use it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move back to one of the questions here. It's an interesting one at the top there. Should we be refocusing the media narrative around AI on the positive potential for society and inclusivity rather than the doomsday scenario? Who would like to? Darren, you're nodding. Over to you.
Yes. Because I literally don't think we have a choice. If I look at the country, and I'm sure many of you will agree with this, the economy is not in a great place, and it is in rapid decline in comparison to many other countries. We have an aging population, so we have fewer people in work increasingly over time. Our public services are in a horrific state of affairs, and we've got enormous challenges to deal with as a country. And I literally think we have two journeys. We can either say, don't worry, we'll just kind of keep bumbling along and doing what we're doing, aren't we great? And we will decline in comparison to other countries. And at some point, people will realize that we've really fallen quite far down the league table, and that's going to create a lot of anger, I think, and distrust in our institutions. Or we can say, we've got to get a hold of this and modernize the country and transform it for the future. And the only way I think we can do that on economic productivity, on jobs, on skills, on public sector reform, even on big issues like climate change, on Britain's role in the world, is around adopting technology across the economy. But we will not do that if people don't see it as an exciting opportunity for them at work, for their pay, for their access to education or the healthcare system. And the worry is that the continued kind of understandable highlighting of risks that we've got to mitigate will create a culture of fear, which is a disincentive for adoption. And if we get that wrong, we will miss the almost industrial revolution style opportunity for economic growth in the decades ahead.
Thank you. Mark, I think you've got some examples as well of kind of positive outcomes.
Well, actually, just on that point, it's probably worth noting that in the robotics industry alone, I think the UK is currently 27th in terms of adoption of robots on a global scale. So I think it's at the bottom of the table in terms of G7 and so on. So parking the debate about adoption of robots and implication, it just means that we're not actually dealing with this stuff in anger, day to day, and understanding the risk and being able to explore all the questions that have already come up. So I think your point is dead on. We need to do the same with AI, right? In terms of positive things, I think for me the model with this is, what is AI good at? Or let's sort of get to the maths, inputs, outputs, prediction, basically. So it's about finding patterns in huge volumes of data at its simplest. There's an awful lot of stuff in the collective that would be really beneficial to the individual. I sort of think of it along the lines of model us, then model me. So if we can understand the collective, well, if you think about it, civilization, humans, however we prospered, it's because we pooled resources, right? We've pooled all these things, data, knowledge is a thing we can pool. If we can use technologies like this to mine the implications of what's in that data and then find out on an individual level where we sit in that pool of things, then it starts to reflect and impact the individual, and we can make decisions about our lives. I think where it'll have most impact is in predictive things. So, simple things like we know already, without surrendering a huge amount of data, how our life outcomes are influenced by things like our attachment styles in terms of well-being, in terms of, you may have one leg shorter or longer than the other. That will impact how your hips progress when you get to your 50s and 60s, all these sorts of things. Being able to understand how we then, mapped to that global model and those patterns, I think would help people have informed decisions early in life before, if you like, the damage is done, and then it's all about repair. So I think really for me it's about helping that preventative stuff is where a lot of the technology could help.
I think that's a really interesting example around preventative medicine because it's tackling two issues. So one is thinking about the use of machine learning, for example, when in population health. So it's looking at large numbers of individuals with large amounts of data, but then it's honing that down into a kind of precision medicine track to help individual life stories. Any other positive examples? I'm going to go to Joanne first, yeah.
Add, in regards to making AI more inclusive, the positive aspect is that we are now at the stage where you can talk to anyone from any background and mention AI and they have a general idea of something. And I think that we're at an opportunity now where we can encourage those from underrepresented backgrounds to get into the space, to bring up the problems they have. Like we mentioned healthcare. I know we're trying to be positive, but I spot bias everywhere. So in healthcare, AI has been used to detect skin cancer, but it's been shown that with darker skin tones, it's not as effective. Now is the time to bring people in to specialize research in that and to look at how that detection would work for darker skin tones. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in sparking ideas and creativities in the individuals who weren't part of the elitist rooms before.
Thank you. And Tom?
Well, maybe I should contextualize what I said earlier. The law, the bit I inhabit, is the edge. So they're not alarmist things. That's the edge. That's what because I live on the outside of the box, if you see what I mean. We frame the box. And so we have to police the borders. That's what lawyers do. So that's just the nature of living in that dark space, I suppose. But the bit in the middle, I think, to come back to Darren's point, I think what's missing really across, because I just come back to these things and I just think of them as machines, We need to have a coordinated central strategy about what we're doing with this kind of stuff. We lost the regional development agencies. We seem to have lost our way. We're outside Europe, so you don't get that strategic direction that was coming out of European directives. So something is missing here about some sort of coherent narrative about the universities linking together. I mean, it's great to see this kind of thing, but we need that coherent narrative to drive us forward and work out which areas we're going to specialize in, which agglomerations we're going to have. And that just seems to be missing. We seem to have front page of the newspapers that are either Prince Harry or people, poor people trying to cross the channel in boats. We're not having a grown-up conversation about what directions we want to invest in. And the political discourse at the moment is a long way away from, I think, what the public needs. So my plea, I suppose, as a researcher and academic in Bristol is to, we just need to nurture those bits of stuff that we're doing well and grow them and work out how we can do them better.
Thanks. We've got a question from the floor here. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, because you're saying about having this coordinated strategy and direction, and who should have the voice to decide on this direction and who should be there, because I think from what you've been talking about, it seems that AI is going to impact future generations the most, and just the future in general. So when we talk about also the future of the nation and just like in society, and the UK and the position of the UK in the world, just my question is, how are we going to involve young people in this decision making?
Thank you. Darren first.
Well, the kind of constitutional answer that we have in this country is that, in theory, that should be the House of Commons, but of course that's full of bias, because I think it's still majority men, it's quite old, it's definitely not diverse on lots of other mechanism. So you've got to try and find a way to solve that problem and plug it into the constitutional debate. Because we have an institutional structure for a reason, that's how we deliver these types of strategies. But it can't just be a kind of consultation that a department publishes in Westminster and then Microsoft responds and then like a few other people and then we decide policy on that basis. When we're talking about something as pervasive as this issue. So I'm a big fan of citizens' assemblies. Some people aren't. I presented the first citizens' assembly on net zero to Parliament. My committee and others funded that work. And I think it was a fantastic experience where we brought a representative sample, 106 people from across the country that represented the country. Some people were climate deniers at the start and climate activists. And by the end of a number of weeks of hearing in rooms like this, evidence and independent expertise, they had to come to some decisions together. And they did that perfectly sensibly. I think we should be doing that type of work on these types of issues such as AI and feeding that into the parliamentary and the government processes that we have in Westminster.
Thank you. Really interesting answer. Mark?
Just a quick thing on your question as well. My sense, I'm frustrated by this, is that the answer, the knowledge about injustice is out there. It's in the data. It's in people's lived experience, but it doesn't have a voice. And I think you could argue that we have the tools and the technology to in some way capture that and at least have a sense of it, but it yet doesn't have a voice for all the things that we've just discussed. I'm not saying I have an answer here, but I just feel that data, that understanding of what it implies needs a bigger voice so that we can solve and address some of these challenges.
Thank you. Yeah, the lady in the green top. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much. You talked about kind of rankings and kind of making sure the UK doesn't fall behind, but those rankings don't necessarily benefit everyone within the country. And so one very well-known risk is job losses, as we've talked about. Labour itself said this week that we could be facing deindustrialisation on the scale of the 70s and 80s. So what should we be doing about mitigating for that very, very real risk that's happening right now, both in terms of the people who will lose their jobs and planning for the future as well?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One, it would be helpful if we had a skills policy in this country. If you ask pretty much any worker, unless they're in a particularly good business, where do you go if you want to learn new skills or get new qualifications? I mean, nobody knows. I mean, you could stop work and go back to university. You might do an OU kind of course, but we need a much more pervasive, ongoing skills and training culture in the workplace so that you're continuously learning. And businesses have not been investing in this for many, many years for various reasons, and government's not been incentivizing them to do so. And government has said, well, it's not our problem. What happens in businesses is up to businesses. And we're going around in circles and failing the public as a consequence. So you've got to get a hold of that. The second thing I would say on work is that we should see it as a positive opportunity. And we're not going to get adoption in an inclusive way that leads to opportunity for everyone unless we're having this conversation with workers right now. What happens today, and I often have businesses before my select committee in the House of Commons who are implementing technology in the workplace to improve their productivity and profits, but they put it on workers, they don't do it with workers. And then the issue gets escalated to us in Parliament, and you've got surveillance and oppression in the workplace, mental health challenges, and yes, the business might have made a little bit more profit, but actually it's a horrible place to work. It's completely the wrong way around in terms of how you implement technology. So employers should be talking to workers today and saying, we're going to have to do this in order to be profitable and competitive and improve the quality and outcome of our services. Be part of the discussion. Let's look at what the options are, how we might implement it, how we feed back on that, how we provide you with the training and skills opportunities. And the government, using whatever tools it has, should be incentivizing businesses, workers, and trade unions to take that approach. Because if we don't get that right, we're not going to get the rapid adoption in the way that will benefit the economy and our public services.
Thanks. A view from higher education, maybe, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I do think there's more to be done with the coordination of research in the universities and kind of the local economy. I think that seems to have been, it's there, but it used to be there when I started off in academia 20 years ago. It was much more apparent. I think that could come back, and I think there's also. I think we're doing it reasonably well, actually, in Bristol, of this thing of having the universities connected to local corporations which are springing up, and that is a way of kind of using local entrepreneurship, of giving agency to people to develop things, and perhaps access to regional funding, that kind of thing. But I think just one thing in terms of the question and the kind of the local, what you do if you're a young person facing these things. I think I set my first NGO up when I was 25. That was to set up street parties because it was really difficult. And I think just do some stuff, get engaged, think what you want to do, and get it, and don't sort of think that it has to be old white men like me doing this. It really is. It is for people to feel, and we're very lucky in this country. We're not surveilled by the state. We're not being kidnapped. We've got this wonderful kind of opportunities in front of us, and sometimes I think our own fears stop us from doing things. So get engaged is my get political, get engaged, and do it from a sense that you can get stuff done rather than other people need to do it.
Can I also ask you, Joanne and Mark, in terms of employee upskilling? I mean, do you have any advice for people or thoughts about how we might empower people to do that more easily?
So there's two aspects to it. There's those in employment now who are concerned about losing their jobs. I would, in regards to getting engaged, there's a way to involve AI in your process, whatever you're doing, so experimenting. But there's another aspect of it, people who are just being made redundant and so forth. I think there's an element the government can do to start bringing everyone up to an understanding of what AI is and how to use it. I was thinking, I don't know if anyone remembers the Couch to 5K and how popular that was, and whether you actually ran a 5K, I don't know, I didn't. But in that process, going through that app, which was free to download, which I had to do several steps, I developed an understanding of running to the bare minimum. I think something like that, if we can bring the population, the whole population from all backgrounds, up to a certain level of understanding of AI, that will embrace us better for the future, rather than relying on access, privilege, and money to say they can get involved.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'd echo that actually, and it touches back on inclusivity as well. One thing we found when we did a lot of robotics outreach a number of years ago, where we visited schools on a national level with effectively robotic small grand challenges for kids. The really interesting thing, two things. One, kids who tended not to be always engaged, let's say in the pure academic sense, were wholly engaged. And the other really interesting thing for me was we had a 50-50 split in terms of gender and so on. So it was clear that providing a real hard example of getting hands-on, getting involved, the creativity coming out just really worked. I think the issue is, and we do a lot of this in our own business at the moment, we take a lot of folks on to do this. I just wonder how joined up it is. It's organic, which is great, but it would be really good to see that back to policy again, a skills policy which could help drive that. And there's nothing better than getting actually involved in hands-on a thing to understand what it is, in my own view.
Thank you, yeah. So we've just got a few minutes left. I'm looking at the room to see if there are burning questions that people haven't asked. Yeah, we've got one here. Thanks, Anthony.
Hi. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the ethical and regulatory questions at an international level, given that a lot of the data that is collected on a large scale is international in nature, and the organizations that collect it are international in nature.
International versus national.
So there is one international framework that all member states of the United Nations have signed up to, the UNESCO AI Ethics Framework, which is anchored in human rights. And they've done a lot of great work about how that can be implemented in the workplace. The UK is a signatory to it. There are kind of a couple of problems, though. One, China's signed up. Is it using it? No. So are you going to get complete international harmony? No. The second thing is the UK signed up. Has it implemented it? No. And three, does the UK government know how to implement it? No. And so at the multilateral level, that is an exemplar case study because it doesn't exist in any other forum or multilateral body. And the work is really good quality. But you've then got to get individual countries to implement it and then encourage them to work together. And I think the real kind of national security risk right now is that we are ending up with regulatory blocks that are not connected in a kind of UN way. And because of the fear around national security and technology competition and geopolitics, sadly, I do think we are going to end up in an environment where, quote unquote, the West takes a certain approach, and Sino-Russia and other countries will take a different approach to the way that they use these technologies, as we've seen being implemented in places like China already.
Thanks. Anyone else want to respond to that? Mark? And then...
This is sort of related to your question, Andy. It's not directly answering it, but I think there is a common issue that we face internationally, which we haven't touched on yet, which is that it costs a lot of energy to train on that data, and we haven't looked at that yet. So I think in 2018, server farms were running at around 1-2% global energy supply. It's gone up to 4% in 2020. It's estimated to be somewhere of the order up to 20-21% by 2030 if we keep going at the rate we're going. That has a huge carbon sustainability impact that's not fully been addressed, and I think that's something we're going to have to fold into this as well.
Thanks, Tom. Do you want to speak to that as well?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I've just been involved in negotiating an international treaty on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, which completed last year, and it's just being signed off. We're just chasing various signatory parties around the world at the moment. I think that was 25 years in its inception. So I think, particularly given where we are with China and Russia and the kind of great breakdown of the international consensus, it's going to be tricky to do something at the international level. Not impossible, because a lot of the commercial companies want that for standardization purposes. So there are international agreements between the various companies. On the really nasty stuff, what people are doing, there's a lawyer called Jason McHugh, who's quite interesting, who has been chasing down the multinational companies, and where they're doing something badly in a jurisdiction where the rule of law isn't operating, they're suing them in another jurisdiction. So he's quite interesting to watch. He's the guy who's taking the Rohingya case, which could bankrupt Facebook. I mean, or bankrupt Meta if it comes off. And the rights and wrongs of that, I don't know, but there is this process of empowerment, if you like, for the individual to take on these huge beer moth organizations. And increasingly what's funding him is increasingly there's a public awareness through operations such as the Good Law Project that you can take individual cases which will have systematic consequences. It's why the individual circumstance, although it's not, sorry scientists, but individual circumstances in law do matter because they set precedent.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're almost out of time. So what I'd like to do is invite the panel just to turn around and look at the last question, the bottom question there. One word answer only. Each panel member's overall view on AI's impact on society, good or bad. Come on, we can do this. This is the last one. Right, Mark.
I'm going to challenge that question. I think that's the problem, right? We want binary answers to the thing that is not binary, right? There's a lot of, it's back to precision again, there are precision answers. So if I talk about the environmental impact, it's bad. If I talk about some of the things you mentioned earlier, it's good. I'm not going to say it's a binary answer, because that's the issue.
Thank you, yeah. Joyanne, your response?
I can't do one word. Intersectionally messy.
Thank you. Good. Darren?
Good.
Tom?
I'm not sure I can answer that, sorry. I defer that to greater minds than mine. I think, wait a sec, history will judge us on that.
Okay. Yeah. That's a nice place to end. Thank you so much. Been a really lively discussion, loads of interaction from you guys, much appreciated. Thank you, Mark, Joyanne, Darren, Tom. Really, really interesting session. Thank you so much. Let's give our panel a round of applause.